Our next question is, what is critical moral deliberation? Well, on the handout, defining key terms in business ethics, which hopefully you have in front of you somewhere, there's basically a reference to 4 components in our unpacking of this term. First, critical moral deliberation can be viewed as basically critical thinking as applied to moral issues and ethically problematic situations of the sort that we might find in the business context. But if critical moral deliberation requires a reference to the notion of critical thinking, well, what is critical thinking? We've got to ask ourselves. In a nutshell, it's basically what philosophers do. It's independent reflection on and examination of our own values, beliefs, and practices, as well as those of others and of society as a whole. According to a figure by the name of John McMurtry, who is a Canadian political philosopher at the University of Guelph, critical thinking is, this is a quote, a process of interrogation which not only reveals the nature of what is, but also what is problematic with what is. For McMurtry, it's only in virtue of a society's citizenry asking dangerous questions, what he calls dangerous questions, that it's able to progress. For him, in totalitarian states, critical questioning is forbidden, and because of this, the people are liable to be oppressed, to be slaves of the rulers. But in a healthy liberal democracy, it's through critical questioning that oppressive situations can be revealed in the public eye and that change can be made. Critical questioning ensures that life can flourish in this sense rather than being trampled on. The importance of critical thinking is that we can challenge the established laws, norms, mores, values, conventions. We can challenge the status quo if we need to. And the ability for critical thought and potentially dissent, which provides checks and balances against excesses and misconduct of those who may be in power, this is essential in a liberal democratic society. According to McMurtry, and this is a direct quote, inquiry proceeds by posing questions, by interrogating subject matters or reality itself so as to lay underlying connections or structures bare. Such question posing becomes critical when it not only reveals the shape or nature of what is, but also reveals what is problematic with what is, what calls for reconstruction of position or fact to achieve some more adequate understanding or action. He goes on to say, we can see this pattern of questioning and disclosing, criticizing and reconstructing at work in one form or another in any developmental process mediated by thought, in any project to overcome past limits by some higher understanding or practice. He goes on to say, the history of humanity's learning, we might say, is a history of variations on this theme of critical thinking. Second, critical moral deliberation can be said to involve a process of critical reflection, reasoning, and or argumentation in relation to any moral issue, employing the standards of logic as well as potentially the criteria stipulated by one or more of the ethical theories from the history of philosophy. We'll be taking up several of these ethical theories in this course: virtue ethics, Christian ethics, contractarianism, utilitarianism, Kantian deontology, situational deontology, feminist ethics, existentialism, and we'll be cultivating our ability to apply them in different contexts in business. These theories provide well-founded criteria of judgment with which we can differentiate right from wrong. A keen grasp of them can also help us to be able to identify situations that call for moral decision-making or deliberation to begin with. Critical moral deliberation involves rigorous thought processes of selection based in rational decision-making, wherein, in conjunction with these moral theories, we begin to generate alternative possibilities for action using our imagination and creativity. Then we weigh these options, a process in which there is an elimination of actions or alternatives we deem to be wrong or unethical, but also a positive decision about how we ought to act or what is right in any given situation. Next, the process of deliberation involves deciding the right best course of action in any morally problematic situation. And last, it involves acting in correspondence with the results of these deliberations, so as to engage in authentically ethical praxis or practical action. This term praxis, which appears on the handout in front of you, this is an Aristotelian concept meaning practical action. It just means the correspondence of critical thought and action, namely that our actions are guided by and consistent with the results of our critical moral deliberations. It basically means the marriage of critical thinking and action, putting into practice what we've preached or what we've decided upon in our deliberation. The third major component of this, in unpacking this term, critical moral deliberation, involves the notion that we can debate and make critical judgments pertaining to the limitations, the correctness, and the appropriateness of any of the ethical theories from the history of philosophy for use in deciding the right course of action in any given situation. As we'll see, some of these theories will tell us conflicting things about what we ought to do, and it's up to us to mediate between these kinds of conflicts. Each of the theories offer differing approaches to moral deliberation, and we need to decide which approach is the right one. The fourth component of this term, critical moral deliberation, involves the notion that the individual or the business person or the employee in question is a moral agent who is ultimately responsible for his or her actions and decisions, and can challenge established norms and laws, initially hopefully along appropriate channels, of course, rather than simply being a conformer to them. In some cases, the extent of the challenge may prove to justify the need to blow the whistle on one's employer or the firm once the potential for a satisfactory resolution from inside of the firm becomes exhausted. So critical moral deliberation refers to an engagement in an autonomous process of reflection and decision-making beyond mere conformism to established norms, as in what's called moral conformism. In respect to professional ethics, including business ethics, critical moral deliberation suggests moral agency, the notion that we as individuals are ultimately responsible for our actions, even beyond the influence of institutional cultures and organizational norms and protocols. Just because there's a common opinion or a prevailing view in a firm or in society doesn't make it right. And engaging in critical moral deliberation means that while established norms, laws, codes of ethics, etc. are generally to be followed, they're not absolute. They're not absolute guiding principles for action that apply in every single situation. Deferring to conventional morality is questionable, since many societal norms may permit morally questionable acts. And in international business, as we might see, we have to navigate many distinctive sets of norms pertaining to different cultures and societies. So just because there's a common opinion or a prevailing view in society doesn't make it right. The fact is that many societal norms permit morally questionable acts. And if we conform to these societal norms, well, we wouldn't be doing the right thing. There's all sorts of research in psychology and experiments that have been done that have suggested that group consensus has impeded the view of individuals as to what is real. In certain groups, if people tell you that a line is smaller than another line, but it really isn't, well, psychologists have proven that on some occasions people are influenced by what others tell them, which deviates from the reality out there. Other experiments have revealed that a lot of the time when instructed by perceived authorities, for example, people who are dressed up in white lab coats, people's actions have been influenced such that they do things that are immoral, such as in Stanley Milgram's experiments, where people were instructed to administer electric shocks to other people, which they did just because The authority told them to do that. There's also a tendency to think that distinguishing right from wrong is only useful in that it prevents us from getting into trouble, or it prevents litigation of our firm. This isn't wrong, but it doesn't it simply represents the lowest or minimal standard of morality. Rather than doing whatever we can get away with, without getting into trouble, probably we ought to hold ourselves to higher standards and have a desire to actively do the right thing in all of our business dealings. There's also a tendency out there to believe that being ethical or living a moral life is just a means that will somehow lead to our flourishing in life and our happiness. That somehow you're going to have a nicer car, a more handsome or more beautiful spouse, etc., etc., if you're moral. While certain philosophers, as we'll see, will emphasize that morality is a key to attaining happiness, others will de-emphasize this. That being moral is not about happiness, and it's not about what we get out of the situation. It's not what we get out of being moral that's important. It's about doing the right thing. In the next video lecture, I'll talk a little bit about some of the ways of thinking, some of the flawed views concerning morality that stand opposed to critical moral deliberation, that contrast sharply with critical moral deliberation.